Hello, it's Scott Manley here. It's the 2nd of April. I am days away from taking my private pilot check ride, but I still have to get in another batch of deep space updates. And yeah, it's been 2 weeks since the last one, and we have a fairly large number of launches to talk about. So let's start. Let's rewind to the 22nd of March when the Kuaizhou rocket, designed by, of course, X-Space in China, launched the Tianmu satellite into a sun-synchronous orbit. Now, it's believed this satellite is going to be used for weather forecasting, meteorology, and of course, the Kuaizhou is another one of those four-stage solid rocket motors built by those quasi-private organizations in China. 23rd of March, we had Terran 1, and boy, yeah, good luck, had fun. Well, we did have fun. Unfortunately, it didn't make it to orbit, but it made an amazing attempt on the first stage. And frankly, a lot of people didn't believe that a fully 3D printed piece of hardware could handle the rigors of launch and ascent through the atmosphere. And it turned out that the problem was more that the second stage engine didn't appear to light. It did appear to be producing some thrust, but it wasn't able to get itself ignited properly. This was a well-covered launch, and I'm going to say their social media efforts were top-notch. They got all the best launch photographers in it. There have been some stunning images coming out of this, but I think my favorite video really is just the crew, the people on the ground, watching this, jumping around, enjoying things, squealing with delight as rocket scientists are supposed to do. If you don't get excited about rocket launches, why are you building rockets? But anyway, yeah, moving onwards. 23rd of March also, there was a Soyuz 2.1A carrying the Bars M number 4, also known as Cosmos 2567. This is from Plesetsk. It was carried into a sun-synchronous orbit. So we know that this is a military electro-optical Earth observation reconnaissance satellite. It's basically the fourth one of this design. We know that the first two have failed, and there's only one that's been operating. This fourth one went up, it spent a couple of days, adjusted, and circularized its orbit at about 400 kilometers. But yeah, military satellite from Russia. 24th of March, the Rocket Lab launches from Mahia in New Zealand two Black Sky satellites, Black Sky number 18 and 19, with their mission called The Beat Goes On. So these are a set of low Earth orbit Earth observation satellites. This is the 6th launch for Black Sky by Rocket Lab, and I believe it's the last one of their 2nd generation satellites that provide 1 meter imaging for, customers, including the National Reconnaissance Office, by the way. Black Sky are developing a 3rd generation satellite. 24th of March, Falcon 9, we had another batch of Starlink, Group 5-5, 56 satellites launched from Florida. 26th of March, ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, used their Launch Vehicle Mark III, formerly the GSLV Mark III, to launch a batch of 36 OneWeb satellites, completing the OneWeb constellation. They are now able to offer all the capabilities. That doesn't mean that that will be the last OneWeb launch. It's just the constellation is complete. They will need a number of spares, but that is a big landmark for OneWeb, who of course is competing somewhat with Starlink in their own way. 28th of March, the Shavit 2 OFEC 3. This was a surprise. So Shavit is an Israeli launcher. It's a solid rocket motor, and of course Israel is interesting because they want to have their military launches happen from their own territory, and to avoid upsetting anyone, they launch across the Mediterranean, which means they go westwards instead of eastwards. Their satellites go into a retrograde orbit. And so, yeah, the OFEC series are believed to be they're believed to be reconnaissance satellites. And since they mentioned radar, that probably means synthetic aperture radar satellites. Yeah, this is their domestic launch. There was a big flash during ascent, which I think looks like just some fuel being expended. But the satellite, you made it to orbit, so that wasn't a problem with the launch vehicle. 29th of March was a Soyuz 2.1V. Now, this is the one that is not a real Soyuz. It doesn't have those 4 strap-on boosters, nor the Korolev Cross. Again, it launched from Plesetsk, carrying a satellite called EMKA, like like E is for experimental. Cosmos 2568 is the official thing. It's probably an imaging satellite, either optical or radar, given the orbit. Not really sure. But yeah, 29th of March, we have another Falcon 9 carrying Starlink Group 5-10. That's another 56 satellites from Florida. Great. I'm not sure what to say about any of these, to be honest. At a certain point, it's another launch, another recovery. Great job. Always cool to see. 30th of March, Long March 2D launching from Taiyuan carrying PiSat 1A and 1B 123. So this is a sort of interesting one because I believe it's a synthetic aperture radar satellite in sun-synchronous orbit. But the satellites, there's 4 of them, and they're going to orbit as a constellation, with like 1A is as the hub, and the 1B, 1 to 3 orbiting as spokes, staying in formation. And I believe they work together to image things in better coverage or detail or anything. I don't know the details on this, but this is what I understand. 31st of March, on Friday, we had a Long March 4C launching from Jiuquan, or Jichuan. I keep on getting told I'm mispronouncing that. But anyway, Yaogan 34-04, which is going into sun-synchronous orbit. It's a reconnaissance satellite. Again, look, the official statement on the Yaogan satellites are always, it will be used for national land surveying, urban planning, road network design, crop yield estimation, disaster prevention, and mitigation. But everybody knows that it's a military system that's doing more than that. I'm sure it might do that, but it will do other things. And second, oh yes, just earlier today there was a huge one. Tianlong 2, now that is a new name you may not have heard of. It's developed by a company called Space Pioneer. They launched... Basically, it's an entirely new rocket design. It's a liquid-fueled rocket burning kerosene and liquid oxygen. And it's, by some arguments, they're the first private company to successfully launch a liquid-fueled rocket to space on their first attempt. Because the first private company to successfully launch a rocket on their first attempt was, Orbital Sciences, who launched the Pegasus from air launch. But yeah, this is an interesting one. They literally practically didn't exist 5 years ago. And they were wanting money to develop their own engines, and they came up with a bunch of stuff. It looks like they've just taken some existing engines, YF-102s, and put them on their own rocket design. And they've been able to get this to orbit. It also sounds like that this may be the first coal-powered rocket, because it's burning kerosene made from coal. You know, you can do this with high carbon fuel stocks. You can run them through chemical processes to basically create hydrocarbon molecules, and then you can refine that into kerosene and ultimately rocket fuel. But that's apparently what this is. Coal-powered rocket, successful first launch. We see that they may be... These are the people that have been putting out images of rockets that look a lot like SpaceX Falcon 9, reusable rockets. Good luck to them. Great that you succeeded with that. It didn't carry a real payload, by the way. It was really only a cube satellite. In theory, it could carry like 1.5 tons to sun-synchronous orbit. So it's a bit bigger than, say, what Rocket Lab is doing. A lot smaller than what SpaceX is doing. And finally, this morning, out of my window, I could see Falcon 9 launching from Vandenberg carrying SDA-01. That's the Space Development Agency. This is a relatively recent creation in the US government. They're basically part of the Department of Defense, and they're the idea is they're going to fast track commercial satellite capabilities into military systems. And this payload is launched in a Falcon 9. It's carrying 8 communications satellites and 2 infrared-based missile tracking satellites that are being developed by Leidos and SpaceX. They're going to orbit in 2 1,000-kilometer altitude polar orbit planes. And so this actually was supposed to launch a few days ago, but as they counted down to 0, there was like a last-minute failure just as they were beginning engine ignition. So they reset, had to investigate what that was. I haven't heard what caused that reset, but this is a relatively new booster. It's only the second flight for this booster. But yeah, it successfully launched this morning and apparently has been successful, with a return to launch site waking up everyone in Lompoc at about, 7:45 on a Sunday morning. So yeah, The other, I guess, so in terms of a private launch, the big thing in the last couple of weeks has been what happened to Virgin Orbit. So the last I mentioned, they had suspended operations and were looking for investments. They did find a potential investor in the form of Matthew Brown, an investor in Texas who apparently his VC firm has put money into SpaceX and Astra, and they were looking at a $200 million potential investment. And there was a lot of stories being written, but apparently that fell through. And yeah, I'm not clear that anyone is working at Virgin Orbit at this time in any engineering capacity. So it looks to me like Virgin Orbit is basically dead. There was some small hope, but honestly, I'm not surprised given that they have a working system, but it's had one failure that would need an investigation, and it's not that competitive compared to other things. They do have some Air launch does offer them some small advantages that other companies can't offer, but it is a very tiny sliver of an advantage that doesn't really work for everyone, for most people. Yeah, NASA has also had to push back the launch of Starliner. And so the Starliner obviously had a successful launch. They were going to launch it with a crew. It was slated to launch towards the end of April, but it looks like they're not getting things together quickly enough. And that if they slip anymore, they were going to run into the Vulcan launch, which is on May 4th. And they're also going to run into the Axiom AX2 launch, which is in early May. And also, they were going to run into the next CRS-24 launch, Cargo Dragon, which has to use the same docking port as Starliner. So it looks like Starliner isn't going to fly until July, late July at this point. Soyuz MS-22, by the way, it left the space station and deorbited with a small amount of cargo instead of crew, and it landed back successfully. It was recovered. Now, I've heard statements saying the temperature could have been as high as 50 Celsius. Those haven't been confirmed by an official source, but I did hear that Sergei Krikalev stated that the conditions inside the capsule were better than the worst case scenarios. And I'm not sure what that translates to. But if Sergei Krikalev says it's comfortable, that wouldn't necessarily mean very much, because he was the guy that ended up stuck in space for a very long time after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He is a tough dude. So, like, a lot of respect to him, but if he told me it was comfortable, I would ask somebody else. Seriously, I love Sergei. He's awesome. So yeah, Japan. Hakuto R mission has successfully reached orbit off the moon. It performed a braking burn, and that took like a 3-month voyage via the L1 point between the Earth and the Sun. Came down, it's now orbiting the moon, and it's getting ready to set up for its landing site. They have not yet announced a landing date, but it can spend a fair amount of time in orbit before it has to commit. By the way, another really big future plan that we need to mention is that we're now starting to see NOTAMs and Notice to Marine trap shipping about potential Starship orbital flight test. And they're starting now like a week out. So we're talking some point in April, probably more than a week away. Probably not too many weeks away, I think is the official term. But this is going to be a flight test from Boca Chica over the Gulf of Mexico, threading between the Caribbean islands best it can. It'll not go into a complete orbit. It's designed so it will re-enter just north of Hawaii and hopefully demonstrate that the heat shield isn't held together by rubber bands and toothpaste, right? The heat shield is the thing I am most concerned about on Starship. They're probably not recovering this, but they are going to be collecting data with it all the way down. So yeah, obviously we're going to be paying a lot of attention to this thing. And hopefully it doesn't go the same way as Blue Origin's NS-23, which we just got something of a report from. We didn't get the complete report because the FAA has to accept it. But their version of the incident report says that there were design changes made at some point in the BE-3 engine on that specific booster, which reduced the film cooling capability and led to the nozzle getting hotter. So the film cooling is where you blow more cool gas in slightly downstream from the combustion chamber, and that sticks to the wall and provides a cool layer of gas to protect the nozzle. The nozzle, in turn, was getting too much heat, and that weakened it structurally, and there were some sparks and flashes observed. But eventually the nozzle failed, and when the nozzle failed, you have this the thrust is no longer straight out, so you have this lateral force that caused the rocket to twist off axis. And as soon as it began to turn off axis, and the gimbal didn't stop it, the capsule, of course, ejected, fired its escape system, and returned safely, albeit after suffering a fairly high G loading for the crew on board, as well as some off-axis loading, as it rolled and pitched and decelerated. So they think they know what's going on with it. They presumably know how they will fix it for future launches, and probably we will see a return to flight for New Shepard this year. One thing we may see leaving the space business this year is Kathy Lueders, who is retiring as the head of NASA human space flight for low Earth orbit. So yeah, she was originally in charge of all human space flight, but then they split that into like the low Earth orbit, space station, cargo, all the commercial stuff that we see. And then there's the exploration, which is basically Artemis going to the moon. So she's been in charge of that for the last few years. And so she's retiring. She's going to be replaced by her deputy, who is Ken Bowersox. And but it's interesting that this will be the 1st of May, which will be around about the 20th anniversary of Ken Bowersox coming back from space for the last time on a Soyuz, which had an awful ballistic off-course re-entry that almost crushed Don Petit. And I will have a story about that, hopefully. So yeah, he's going to be doing that unless they find someone else in the future. Okay, Lockheed Martin have created a new corporation called Crescent Space Services. This is a subsidiary that's going to offer something called Parsec. It's a network of satellites in lunar orbit to support communications for other spacecraft on the moon. So they are basically doing a lunar communications service, which they are going to be selling to providers. So this is basically Moonlink, not Starlink. They sound like they're going to be launching the first satellites in 2025. I'm hoping they get some demand. This is a really kind of interesting part of and really interesting notion. Dawn Aerospace down in New Zealand. Yes, New Zealand is more than just Rocket Lab. They have got approval to start flying their rocket-powered subscale rocket plane design. So it's a vehicle called Aurora. They've been flying it with a jet engine. It's got a big Delta engine. It's like 4 or 5 meters long right now, so it's fairly big, but it's not big enough to actually go to space. So they've got a hydrogen peroxide kerosene engine on it, and they want to start flying that. They think that they will be able to fly this to 100 kilometers above the Kármán line from a launch on the ground. And assuming this works and they can solve their problems, they're going to scale this up to the Mark III, which will be about 22 meters long, and it'll be able to fly up to that altitude, release a second stage, which can then put cargo into orbit. That'll be a cool one to watch because, hey, rocket-powered planes, yeah, my kind of thing. The Indian Space Agency also, they've performed a landing test of their reusable launch vehicle, like autonomous lander experiment. Basically, they carry this spacecraft, this aircraft, on a helicopter up to altitude, and then they released it, and it flew back to the runway autonomously, demonstrating the gliding capabilities. It didn't deploy the landing gear, that was left out. So this design looks similar to an X-37. It's got very stubby wings. It gets a lot of lift from the body. It's got a couple of 45-degree rudder Vator type control surfaces. It'd be cool if they actually launched this on a rocket. Hope to see that in space. But yeah, lunar rover developer Astrolab, they've signed an agreement with SpaceX to launch their Flex rover to the moon on a future Starship flight. And this is cool because it's one of the first commercial payloads to the lunar surface that's been signed on with Starship. Now, Starship, we know, is supposed to go to the moon to support Artemis III, and it'll have to go there beforehand. I'm not sure if the Flex rover might go on that early demonstration flight, if there's room. But the rover is fairly substantial. They've shown that it can work with autonomous robotic payloads or it can have a couple of astronauts standing on it and driving it around and doing stuff. So that'll be interesting because it's a more expansion of commercial services to the surface of the moon. But yes, speaking of the moon, finally, tomorrow, April 3rd, we are looking forward to the announcement of the astronauts who will be flying on Artemis. That will be 3 NASA astronauts and 1 Canadian astronaut who will head out towards the moon on the SLS and Orion. They will perform a free return trajectory around the moon and come home. They're not going to go into orbit, they're just swinging around, coming home. So yeah, I don't know who's going to be on that list. I think there's some like fantasy crew thing that I accidentally participated in. I said that I probably thought that Reed Wiseman was a shoe-in for at least one of the positions, but other than that, it's complete guesswork. So with that, I'm going to be paying attention to what goes on tomorrow, and of course we'll be paying attention for the rest of the month to see if Starship gets anywhere but its launch pad. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.